Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. Our top story tonight is about the political transition in Washington, D.C. and its likely impact on U.S.-Pakistan relations. After a bitterly contested and divisive presidential election, the United States has elected former Vice President Joe Biden as the 46th President of the United States. Biden comes to the job with vast experience in foreign policy. He was twice chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, co-chaired the NATO Observer Group in the Senate, and chaired the committee's subcommittee on European Affairs. His stances have been liberal internationalist, a position criticized both by realists and non-interventionists. He was a big supporter of a proactive U.S. role in the Yugoslav wars, as well as NATO expansion. As Obama's vice president, he was actively involved in diplomacy with Pakistan, especially in relation to developments in Afghanistan. During the Obama presidency, U.S.-Pakistan relations reached their lowest ebb. While Trump also began by criticizing Pakistan, his last 2 years in Oval Office saw a thaw in relations, though nothing really changed substantially in strategic structural terms. The relations remain transactional, given the U.S. drawdown in Afghanistan, increasing closeness to India, and bitterness with China. How will U.S.-Pakistan relations pan out during the Biden presidency? That's what we shall discuss tonight, though it should be obvious that this is an initial overview. We are joined by Ambassador Tehmina Janjua, former Foreign Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Elizabeth Threlkeld, a former U.S. Foreign Service officer and currently Senior Fellow and Deputy Director, South Asia Program at Stimson Center in D.C. Thank you to both the panelists. Let me begin with Ambassador Janjua here. Ambassador Janjua, quickly, an overview of what do you expect is likely to change, if at all?
Thank you very much. Interesting topic. Yes, what will change is, of course, a change in tone. But we need to see from Pakistan's perspective as to what will change in substance on issues of interest to us. China and the will remain an overarching feature of global politics, but there could be issues on which China and the United States can come together to some extent on climate change, on some issues of trade, etc. The United States will continue an alliance building with other parts of the world. And of course, the centerpiece would be Southeast Asia. India is accepted as a junior partner, and all of this I take from statements that Mr. Biden has made, President-elect Biden has made, and what is available on his website as such. So India is seen as a junior partner for the U.S. There is no likelihood of the rollback in the relations that have been developed under the Trump years and earlier also during the Obama years. There may be some reservations about India's ability to deliver, especially considering its internal situation. On Afghanistan, which is, of course, a matter of very close interest to us, like India and Kashmir. On Kashmir, of course, there will be questions on human rights that will be raised. But we have to see how the Biden administration moves forward on this issue of 370 and 37A. All of this will depend on how the whole things unrolls as far as India is concerned. But yes, India will remain, as I said, a partner for the U.S. On Afghanistan, there would be perhaps not that much rush, as was done by the Trump administration, largely due to the electoral politics, I would say. But there would be, there may be some toning down on Afghanistan, but we have to see. The declaratory position, of course, of Biden has been no endless wars, and that will put a great deal of pressure within Afghanistan as well, some deal of pressure on the Taliban as well. And so we have to see how this has to be worked out. On Iran, of course, which is close to Pakistan, and of course has its links with our relations with the Middle East as well, this will be an interesting time as well. We have to see that there will be nuances and shifts and how to use them to our benefit. The president-elect has spoken about holding a summit on democracy, and Prime Minister Imran Khan has responded in his tweet to it by welcoming it. And a part of that conference would be the focus on corruption as well. So it goes right down the alley of Prime Minister Imran Khan as well. Of course, human rights and democracy will be important. As far as democracy is concerned, Pakistan is democracy and would be glad to participate in this initiative. There would be areas of convergence as well with President Biden-elect. These would be democracy, climate change, on which the Prime Minister Imran Khan has done a lot, and on human rights as well. We should continue to demonstrate the work that we are doing in the human rights field and how human rights impacts on the Kashmiris in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. On Afghanistan, as I said, we should continue to work. Our work should be consistent and transparent, and this should be clearly demonstrated to the new government that will be coming in the United States. So at the end of the day, yes, there will be lots of discussions on non-proliferation. Pakistan has never shied away from discussions on non-proliferation. It just wants a very equal place at the table as a nuclear power. And of course, the NSG question will be discussed, and that is something on which we will demand equality as far as discussions on new membership is concerned. So these are broadly some of the areas on which we will have to work with the new administration in the United States. Some of the new actors that we are looking at that may be coming in the Defense Department, possibly in the State Department, etc. We've acted with them earlier on. And the good thing is that President-elect Biden has been to Pakistan. He has been speaking to our past leadership as well. So it provides an opportunity.
Right. Thank you for this overview. Let me go to Elizabeth Threlkeld here. Elizabeth, what do you think? Sitting in Washington, D.C., of course, you come across people, get their views. But as I said in my opening, even during Trump's administration, nothing really in terms of strategic structural issues, nothing really changed. Now, of course, with the Biden presidency, as I said, he is a liberal internationalist, or that's what his record has been. How far do you think anything is likely to change? And I want you to focus less on U.S.-Pakistan relations in terms of the region, and more in terms of if there at all there is something which is innately substantive to this relationship.
Well, thanks very much, Ejaz. I broadly agree with Ambassador Janjua that we're likely to see more in terms of continuity than divergence from previous administrations. U.S. interests in South Asia are perhaps uniquely nonpartisan in some ways. The interests are enduring, and for the incoming administration, the challenge from U.S. competition with China will continue to play out, and I think broadly drive regional prerogatives. And so that does bring in the U.S. Partnership with India, as well as Ambassador Janjua mentioned, the focus on the Afghan peace process and being able to withdraw U.S. forces from Afghanistan. That's obviously an ongoing process, which Pakistan is supporting. And so that, I presume, will continue, and that support will be called for by the new administration. I think broadly, though, from Pakistan's standpoint, one of the differences that we'll see is the current administration, the Trump administration, has really placed a focus on leadership diplomacy. So we saw the relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Khan that developed particularly in his July 2019 visit to Washington. That is an example of something that I think will broaden out significantly in the incoming administration. And while certainly President-elect Biden does have a great deal of familiarity with Pakistan by virtue of his time in the Senate, his time as vice president. It's really going to be a return to more of kind of a normal process, if you will, where it's run by the State Department primarily, by the NSC, by other agencies. And so for Pakistan, that will mean broadening out contacts and needing to kind of redevelop a relationship that relies on more than just this relationship between leaders. And ideally, structurally, that could provide a bit more ballast for the relationship, right? It won't be morning to morning, tweet to tweet that U.S.-Pakistan relations are turning on, but it will also require deeper investment. And so, I think given the broader environment in Washington, the focus on U.S.-China competition, and also just the focus on U.S. domestic regrowth, regeneration that came through pretty clearly in this election. That's going to be a major focus of the campaign. And so I would say, while there are opportunities, to my mind, the onus falls to Pakistan in presenting those and making those available and mutually beneficial for the U.S. and Pakistan to broaden out the relationship beyond these issues that we've seen drive the discourse over the past couple of administrations.
Right. You mentioned leadership diplomacy. I mean, of course, as we saw, President Trump had this idea of sort of, developing these personal relationships. And you said it'll go back to the NSA, State Department, DOD. So obviously, you're talking about a more institutional approach. Now, the issue with institutional approach is that it can work both ways. There are positives and there are negatives. Negatives in terms of past dependence. And so if we look at the first 6 months to a year, if the administration is focused more internally, then externally, the issues are going to be handled primarily by the Sherpas. And that is sometimes, given past dependence, not a particularly interesting approach to relations. Would you agree with me?
I think over time, it's more sustainable. It relies less on the relationship between two people and can actually provide room for progress, even if it's incremental progress in a relationship where simply the President of the United States has too many priorities on his plate for either side to depend on that as the chief mover of a relationship. And so I think while we might not see as many fireworks over the years ahead, that's, in my view, a positive thing, and that it's worth doing the work and investing in those institutional relationships and building those out at low levels, mid levels, and high levels across those agencies, such that there can be multiple touch points and the relationship doesn't turn into some sort of a bottleneck. It does require kind of a constant investment of attention, and that's what the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the State Department largely run. And President-elect Biden has certainly spoken about re-energizing the State Department and investing more resources in our diplomats. So I do expect that to be a focus going forward.
Right. One final question. The way I look at it, and this obviously goes back to the past 20 years or so. It's very unlikely to have a strategic partnership or relationship between the U.S. and Pakistan. And when I say that, I am thinking more in terms of our expectations that the United States could possibly play a more active role in getting India to reverse what it did in occupied Kashmir, or that we are going to have on the military defense side that we could possibly have a more sort of enhanced partnership kind of a thing. So if that is off the table for structural reasons, then what are the areas that you would identify where there could be a robust Pakistan-US relationship?
I think that is the question to be asking right now. Ambassador Janjua identified a couple of them. I think key among them are climate change and the environment, which is obviously an issue that the current administration in the U.S. hasn't been engaged on, but with President-elect Biden's desire to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord, for example, that provides an opening for cooperation that is less politicized, but to the benefit of both sides. I think likewise, public health is another kind of cross-cutting global issue where there is a great deal of room for cooperation, particularly, I would say, with the Pakistani diaspora here in the U.S. Public health officials and doctors are key within that diaspora, and I think that is a link that both sides should try to invest in and build more out of, particularly, as I was mentioning earlier, given the focus on domestic rebuilding here at home. And so to the extent that the Pakistani diaspora could perhaps serve as something of a bridge in that regard and that effort, I think that would help to connect these domestic and foreign policy issues in a way that could give the relationship a bit more ballast than we've seen previously.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Elizabeth Threlkeld speaking with us. Let me go back to Ambassador Janjua. Ambassador Janjua, there's, of course, despite everything else, we still, export the maximum to the United States. So possibly there are areas of economic cooperation, possibly attracting investment from the United States, which would, I assume, require a more proactive role, facilitative role played by the government, but of course also innovation by the private entrepreneurs. So that's one area. Healthcare is another area. I guess education can be yet another area. And I am focusing on these, as you mentioned in your earlier response, environment and climate change. And I'm focusing on these because to me it seems, and I would want to get your take on this, that any expectation that the United States would go against the Indian interests in the region would be relatively naive.
The areas that you've identified and that Elizabeth has identified are extremely important as a starting points for the new administration in Washington. These are, and I agree with her completely, that the interaction at the leadership level, while helpful, obviously left a lot of groundwork to be done by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Commerce, and other parts of the government, in fact, on the Pakistan side and on the US side, sort of not involved directly. And that's why the strategic dialogue that we had with the United States, the revival of it is, of course, a question that has to be seen and the areas to be covered. We would ideally want the revival of the strategic dialogue between Pakistan and the United States, which was there, which was very useful, which led to some very important cooperative arrangements between both sides. And that's something that we can look forward to with the new Biden administration. As far as the U.S. administration trying to do anything to the disadvantage, so to say, of India is something that we need to be, or I agree with you, we need to be clear on. We do not expect in the United States to take a position that would be disadvantageous to either Pakistan or to India, but to have a more just and a more clear position, a more pragmatic position on both sides with regard to relations with both sides. It is very clear that the situation that prevails in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir right now, in addition to being the other problems that exist, the line of control issues that are there, the one point that we must remember in that context is that President-elect Biden has said no endless wars, and this falls in the way that the situation is developing on the line of control and how the United States can play a role in telling India that it should stop its aggressive actions across the line of control. And secondly, and most importantly, the treatment of the Kashmiris is down the alley of President Biden-elect as well, because it falls within the context of human rights, and it's not Pakistan saying it. The closing down of Amnesty International's offices in Delhi and the non-access to any human rights and non-governmental participants in Indian-occupied Kashmir is clearly indication of the situation prevailing there, and therefore it's important that the United States plays its objective role. And as you say, he's an internationalist, he's a multilateralist, Biden, and therefore we can use his offices or his leaning towards a more human rights just situation to speak about Kashmir as well. India, I agree with you, India has a very close relationship with the United States. What is important for Pakistan is that we develop our own relationship with the United States, irrespective of what the Indian relations with the United States are. It is important that the region as such remains in peace, an objective of President-elect Biden as well. And that's a very firm objective of Pakistan and the government of Pakistan.
Right. Now, when you talk about human rights, we know that Biden and also Vice President-elect Kamala Harris have talked about, occasionally talked about the human rights situation. Kamala Harris is also reported to have spoken about occupied and illegally annexed Kashmir. So, do you think that that is an area where Pakistan can press the point and where the United States would get more proactively involved in telling the Narendra Modi administration in India that the situation in occupied and illegally annexed Kashmir is untenable and that needs to change? And if so, how can we then further build on that in terms of our case?
The fact is that they have spoken about, they're on their agenda, on the agenda of both President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. Human rights is a very central issue, and that's why whether you asking whether we press on this issue, of course, in any discussions with the United States, we do press on the issue of the situation of human rights and the terrible humanitarian situation that is prevailing in Indian-occupied and illegally annexed Jammu and Kashmir. And that is something that will continue to remain not only as an article of faith for us, but as a part of our talking points, whatever we speak to the American officials or the leadership about. So that will remain so. Now, of course, since the agenda of the United States is very clear that they would focus on human rights, so we would expect them to do so in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. And
that is where we push our narrative. I agree with you. That was Ambassador Tehmina Janjua speaking with us. Thank you so much for your insights. We shall take a short break and return to discuss United States Afghanistan policy under the new administration of President-elect Joe Biden. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. In the second segment tonight, we get down to discussing the United States Afghanistan policy under President-elect Joe Biden. Biden comes to the job with a long experience, especially as former President Barack Obama's vice president. By all accounts, he took an active interest in developments in Afghanistan. As Bob Woodward reported in his book, Obama's Wars, Biden was opposed to a surge and rushed to the White House on a Sunday morning to convince Obama that a major surge would mean we are locked into Vietnam. His goal was to contain the Taliban, neutralize al-Qaeda, and get the troops home. Much has happened since then. The U.S. signed a deal with the Taliban in February, and after much meandering, we now have an intra-Afghan dialogue, which is stalled. Meanwhile, violence remains unabated. How will the Biden administration go about the situation in Afghanistan? is what we're going to discuss tonight. I'm joined by Dr. Jonathan Schroden, Director of CNS Center for Stability and Development, and Hamdullah, Hamdard, an Afghan journalist who joins me from Kabul. Thank you to both panelists. Let me begin with Dr. Schroden. Dr. Schroden, it's interesting that President-elect Joe Biden has generally been considered what one can call variously as a liberal internationalist or a Wilsonian. I mean, he was very proactive in terms of the Yugoslav wars. But when it came to the surge in Afghanistan, he wasn't particularly convinced that it's going to work. And as I quoted from Woodward's book, he actually tried to convince President Obama that it's not going to work. And as a matter of fact, interestingly enough, President Obama privately said to Joe Biden that this is a point that he should raise in the meetings, and which he did. Of course, he was overridden later, but that allowed President Obama the space to tell the generals and everyone that I can't lose everyone in the Democratic Party. So how is he going to go about this now that there has been a movement towards talks? Is there anything that he would like to do differently, or he would want events to run the course that they are supposed to run?
It's a good question, and you're right. He back, in 2008, when he and President Obama took office, they did a full-blown Afghanistan policy review, and as part of those deliberations, as you said, then Vice President Biden was very much in favor of what he described as what he called a counterterrorism plus option, which was designed to very narrowly focus U.S. interests in Afghanistan on the defeat of al-Qaeda at that time. And if you remember, one of the first things that he and President Obama did when they took office was to ramp up the drone war inside of Pakistan, targeting very, very vigorously al-Qaeda leaders for the first couple of years of their presidency. And when President Trump took office, it was a similar situation where he inherited a situation in Afghanistan that he was not particularly happy with. And you saw, a smaller surge in troops there. And President Trump allowed increased authorities for the military to engage in Afghanistan as well, more vigorously than they had before. And so I wouldn't be surprised here if you saw President Biden come in, again, inheriting a situation that is, unsatisfactory in Afghanistan in a lot of ways, right? It's very violent, much more so than anybody wants it to be. As you said, the negotiations have stalled a bit. And so things have got to be jump-started to some extent. So I wouldn't be surprised to see President Biden come in, allow the U.S. military and Afghan security forces to be more aggressive than they've been in this active defense posture that they've had since the talks started, in order to, adopt more of a fight and talk stance on our side as well, and on the Afghan government side, in order to try and, apply a bit more pressure on the Taliban. Now, as you said, the key question here is going to be, can he thread the needle somehow between, maintaining the U.S. Taliban agreement and his stated policy preference of maintaining a small counterterrorism element in Afghanistan over the long term. On paper, those two things seem like they are impossible to reconcile, and yet that's the position that he has staked out coming into his presidency. And so it'll be really interesting to see how his team attempts to thread that needle in the months to come.
Right. Let me make a segue. Well, not exactly a segue, but there's a kind of technical question now. Given how bitterly contested this election was, and the divisiveness, and of course the fact that President Trump hasn't even conceded the elections. Now, if he were to say before he leaves that I'm going to withdraw all troops from Afghanistan, is that something that then the next president can reverse? Is it something that, logistically speaking, likely possible before 20th Jan 2021?
Well, so technically speaking, as you say, President Trump will be president until January 20th. And he could at any time in that period, issue an order to get all U.S. troops out of Afghanistan. the logistics of that are such that flying people out of Afghanistan is not hard. You could get the remaining 4,000, odd people out of Afghanistan relatively quickly. It's getting all the stuff out that is much, much harder and takes much, much longer. And so a withdrawal that is responsible in any sense of the word, that doesn't just, up and abandon everything that the U.S. has to include equipment there, which I don't think, Congress would accept, would take much longer than 2 months. And so I see a full ordered withdrawal of U.S. troops before the transition as highly unlikely. I think what's much more likely is that you'll see what the National Security Advisor O'Brien announced, which is a continued drawdown to about 2,500 troops sometime in the January, February-ish timeframe, which actually aligns fairly well with President-elect Biden's stated preference of a counterterrorism plus type level of effort. So I think that's much more likely than a full ordered withdrawal by January 20th.
Right. Stay with Schroden. Let me pull in Hamdullah Hamdard here. Mr. Hamdard, how is Afghanistan, and when I say Afghanistan, the government as well as the intellectuals and analysts looking at this transition, and what do they expect is likely, if at all, change with reference to U.S. policy towards Afghanistan?
The people of Afghanistan are very happy for Biden. They are expecting Biden to support the peace-building process in the country and the intra-Afghan peace negotiations between the Afghan government and the Taliban. They want Biden to support this process. However, the government of Afghanistan is happier because they believe, the government people believe that Biden will probably support the Afghan government more than they support the Taliban, as Trump did. You remember that Trump gave lots of kind of intellectual power to the Taliban, and they were supporting Taliban a lot. Zalmay Khalilzad was accepting everything with the Taliban. Whatever they demanded, he accepted, and that happened. So here, the Afghan government, or the government people, the government officials are expecting Biden to support the current Afghan government and continue the Afghan peace building process, or to support that process directly or indirectly. And there is the risk of the interim government in Afghanistan probably will reduce. This is what the intellectuals or some analysts believe, that probably Biden will not go for the interim government in Afghanistan, and he may support this current government, which is led by Dr. Ashraf Ghani, the current president of Afghanistan. So the risk of the interim government and stopping the peace-building process, these are the expectations of the people. People want Biden to support the peace-building process. However, there is the risk, or they are worried that if the peace-building process is stopped, then again the war will continue, people will be killed, and Afghans will be sacrificed once again because of the foreign policies of the countries, especially the United States' relation with the Afghan government.
Okay, I need clarification with reference to the point that you made about the interim government. Now, the interim government idea was kind of, implicit in any kind of advancement of the intra-Afghan dialogue itself, in terms of how the Afghans on all sides are going to decide the nature of the peace and the structures of that peace deal. And then possibly there could have been, an acceptance of an interim government and then next elections. Now, how would Joe Biden be able to ensure that there's no interim government? Because that is not something which relates to the United States per se, but must inhere in the Afghan peace process itself.
Well, as you know, that the United States policies do not belong to a person. Just the president does not change everything, and they have the Congress there. They decide. There is the system. They decide. However, the Afghan government, considering their relations or their good and friendly or political or diplomatic relations with the Biden and Obama's administration in the past, they kind of expect that Biden will support the Afghan government. I mean, he will be a strong supporter to the Afghan government as compared to Trump's administration. And the interim government's idea that is already created through social media. Even there are some candidates for that one. And Zalmay Khalilzad worked on that a lot to make the people of Afghanistan ready for accepting an interim government, and also increasing of violence, or the increase in violence in Afghanistan. That was also pushing the people towards acceptance of the interim government in the country. And they were almost like kind of ready, mentally ready to accept whoever comes, but they want peace. They want their people to be alive and not to be killed. So the work is going on that one. And probably if the Afghan government can play a very active diplomacy with the United States new administration after January, when Biden will take the office, then the probability is there that there will be no interim government idea before any kind of agreement between the Afghan government negotiators and the Taliban negotiating team. However, the plan was that the U.S. was going to kind of force an interim government even before these two negotiating teams agree upon any kind of agreement.
That's very strange. Anyway, let me take this to Dr. Schroden here. Dr. Schroden, one, the idea of the interim government, as far as my understanding goes, was something that people looked at or conjectured about on the basis of the intra-Afghan dialogue. And what kind of, as I said to Mr. Hamdard, the structures of peace that are likely to emerge through some kind of consensus among various Afghan stakeholders. So I want to get your view on that. Secondly, this idea that President Biden will necessarily support the Afghan government. Now, if we go back, we know that then Vice President Joe Biden wasn't particularly enamored of the performance of then President Hamid Karzai, and made it amply clear to Mr. Karzai that he didn't think that the Afghan government and Mr. Karzai himself was really performing well. So is that going to change in terms of his approach to Ashraf Ghani, who demonstrably has been a weaker president than Mr. Hamid Karzai?
Yeah, I agree with much of what Mr. Hamdard said. I would just point out, I think, as you were alluding to here, that it's worth recalling when Joe Biden was vice president, he took a very narrow view of U.S. interests in Afghanistan, right? I mean, his articulated policy of counterterrorism plus was designed to address what he saw as the sort of front and center U.S. interest in Afghanistan, which was al-Qaeda at the time, and today would be al-Qaeda and ISIS. And other considerations in Afghanistan were secondary to that. And so I don't know that his position has changed much on that. I went back and reread his foreign affairs article that he published back in March of this year, and it struck a very similar tone. Yeah. And so I would be surprised to see him take a much more expansive view of U.S. interest in Afghanistan. With respect to the government, just quickly, I would be surprised if he came in and immediately sought to try and impose an interim government, right? I mean, usually when a new administration comes in, it tries to work with the partners that it has. Yeah. And if those relationships don't work out, then you start to see pivots toward other options.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Schroden. Thank you also to Hamdullah Hamdard for his insights. This is all from In Focus tonight. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.